Hey guys, what's happening? So getting back into Venom Island, to where in this case we're picking up and concluding our talks because there is so much I want to get into about Venom Beyond. And I was about to start to, but I was like, wait a minute, we left Eddie on the island. Just straight up treating Eddie like animal. But for that reason, we're gonna make it right. So let's grab Eddie and get right back to it. But first, if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe to catch the spills every week. And don't forget to hit that bell up top so we can squat up in the comments for the first hour. Alright, so jumping right back in, where we had left off, Eddie had done the unthinkable by severing his hand rather than just letting the Carnage symbiote bond with him, which not only was a shocker, but for Eddie it's another huge loss, with him losing his Venom symbiote at this time as well. And though for that moment it did give him the opportunity to get away, but then after this it put Eddie in this place of where he was alone for the first time in a long time. And really for the first time in a long time, the only thoughts in his head were his own. And this is where it really got dangerous because all the doubts and the insecurities started creeping in. And it really put Eddie in this position where he had to talk to himself like in third person, much like how he would talk to his symbiote. And he had to encourage himself and tell himself to pull it together so he could at least cauterize the wound, stop the bleeding, and then from there at least figure out what's the next step. And so now from here, we then go back to Dylan, who in his case we're not just picking up from Venom Island, but also from our talks about Web of Venom and the tales of the good son between him and Normie, and also the continuation of the return of the sleeper symbiote. And I got all of that linked below if anyone needs a refresher, because I know it's been a while with all the hiatuses, so if you need to check that out and head back, I got you. But from there, where that had pretty much brought us here, is back over to the rooftop of Liz's apartment to where we pick up with Dylan and Sleeper, and Dylan has your sliver of the Grendel symbiote which he had got from Carnage at the conclusion of Absolute Carnage. And at this point, Dylan wants to try to use his powers again to control it, and Sleeper's like, yeah, no, that's pretty much a bad idea. And he's not wrong, because prior to this point, that slither of the Grendel, it's got a pretty evil track record, because in the beginning, it was part of a dragon that was subject to Knull, which in that case, guilty by association. But then after that, when you consider the transformation with Cletus Cassidy, once he started using the Grendel, which in the course of Absolute Carnage, Carnage went from evil to evil plus premium, that wasn't necessarily a good look as well. But then Dylan makes the point that it's not necessarily the symbiote that's evil, but instead Knull and Cletus Cassidy who are the actual one to blame in both cases. Which on one hand is an argument that kind of makes sense, but at the same time it's a huge gamble. But even still, Dylan rolls the dice with this one, Dylan lets it out, Sleeper freaks out, and mainly because he initially sees it attacking Dylan. But Dylan quickly gets it under control, and he uses it to try to reach through to Knull. And this is an idea he had got because he had noticed before that the Grendel, prior to this point, it had been acting like an antenna and allowing Knull to get into Dylan's dreams. And because of that, Dylan just figured, why not just use it the other way around and find Knull? But when Dylan does this and his eyes go black and he just starts floating, like the Sleeper, like this is the opposite of everything looking like it's okay. But in the case of Dylan, what's happening is he's connected to the symbiote hive, and though it's initially overwhelming hearing and seeing through so many eyes and ears, but with doing this, he then sees through the Venom symbiote, and it's here where he discovers that his dad's in trouble. But it's here on the Island of Bones where we see Eddie climbing this communication tower, and the Carnage symbiote, which at this point also has the Venom symbiote, it tells Eddie that there's no point at trying to reach for help because at this point it's just about over. And Eddie tells the Carnage symbiote, no, I came up here to pray. And the Carnage symbiote's like, man, who you came up here to pray to? Ain't nobody trying to hear yo because he told him he came up here to pray to Thor. And when they're shocked by lightning, this then separates both the Venom and the Carnage symbiote, with Eddie using a similar tactic to what he had used in the subway station back in Absolute Carnage. But even at this point, with separating the two symbiotes from himself and each other, this then sets off the races for which symbiote will get to him first. But at this point, with everything that Eddie's been through, plus being shocked by lightning, he just passes out. And from there, the next thing he sees is himself waking up in a chopper with Captain America and a missile heading towards the Island of Bones with the Venom symbiote and the Carnage symbiote still on it. And though when he sees this, he begs Cap to turn around to get the Venom symbiote, but when this happens, like it all just takes place so fast that there's nothing he can do about it. But after that, he then blacks out again to where this time it's been 3 weeks, and he wakes up in his hospital bed with the Avengers right outside, and he can't make out what they're saying, but he can tell it's not good. And really just from the looks on their faces, it's like this look of pity, and even on Iron Man's face, even though it don't move. But right after this, Cap then brings Dylan in, and really at this point for the most part to tell Eddie that he can no longer have custody over Dylan, and not even so much official custody, but more so because of the whole situation of Dylan and Eddie living with Liz, and then Cap telling Eddie that he's actually been out for months and not only 3 weeks. And on top of that, Eddie, you failed even further because Knull's here. And it's really at this point where we begin to realize that there's a bit of exaggeration going on here, because while Eddie's laying here in this calm New York hospital and Cap just points to the window, and all of a sudden Knull is just moonwalking through Manhattan with all kind of hell breaking loose. And it's really in this moment as a reader where you're like, okay, wait a minute. Like, would the Avengers really be in here throwing Eddie a pity party if this was really happening? And on top of that, when he turns back around and Dylan and Cap have left and one of the RNs come in and they hook him up to this needle, only for Eddie to find out that it's Cletus Cassidy pushing the Carnage symbiote into his blood system, then it's like, okay, like either this hospital got some really strong drugs or this is just a really bad dream. But it's actually in this moment that we find out that the Carnage symbiote had made its way to Eddie first, and with doing so, it started to torture his mind with these delusions of failures to Dylan, to his symbiote, to the Avengers, and to the world, while hijacking his body at the same time. Which brings Eddie into the scenario which he had cut off his hand to avoid in the first place, and he don't even know it. And it's probably better that way for the time being, because imagine him getting that news like now, like he would lose his mind within his mind and like go out of his mind. But it's here where we jump back to Dylan, who is connected with the Hive and found his way over to the Venom symbiote, who had noticed Dylan reaching out to where he called Dylan for help. And with seeing this, and in Dylan's case, kind of filling out each ability like as we go, but with doing this, Dylan opens this doorway, and it's like with these things that Dylan is doing, the Venom symbiote then tells him like, hey, these are only things that Knull's supposed to be able to do. And it's a little crazy for us to see on one hand, because one, we're still figuring out what Dylan can do, but at the same time, it's still kind of a similar situation with Knull, which we'll talk more about soon, because we're still figuring out what Knull is capable of doing. But even still in this case, it's like a bit of foreshadowing with showing us a bit more of Dylan's abilities. But it's here where Dylan tells the Venom symbiote that he's gonna remote pilot the symbiote in order to get close and help his dad, and it's here where the Venom symbiote tells Dylan that with doing this he doesn't have to take on a human form, which then causes Dylan to choose the form of a T-Rex. And this brings a few things to mind here, because one, like going back to this now, like after we've started the death metal playlist, it kind of makes you think of the similarities between this Venom-saurus Rex and your Batmanosaurus, and it kind of makes you think for a second like they would totally be the next Spider-Man meme, just way bigger with much shorter arms. And if anybody wants to draw that up, feel free to drop it in the Discord, link below. But keep in mind here, like even with Dylan doing this, he can't necessarily kill the Carnage symbiote because his dad's body's in there. And so really the plan is for him to get close enough and buy some time for Dylan to go in his father's mind and sever the connection between the Carnage symbiote and Eddie. But during this fight, we then skip over to Eddie, who's having this conversation to where he's telling someone like this full breakdown of like when he first became Venom and how initially he wanted to kill Spider-Man and how even at the time he believed it was the right thing to do. But of course, even looking back now, he understands that that was kind of insane, and then he goes on to tell this person or whoever he's speaking to more about everything up to this point through Absolute Carnage to the War of Realms, Web of Venom, so on and so forth. But then it's here where we see Eddie in this prison within his mind. But now at this point he sees Dylan approach him, but initially he doesn't believe it because he thinks the Carnage symbiote is messing with his mind once again, much like the visions in the hospital with Knull pop locking through Times Square. But it's here where Dylan assures his father that it's truly him and that Dylan has had powers this whole time, just that he was afraid to tell his father, which really hits Eddie on a personal level with everything that he's been afraid of up to this point. But it's here where the symbiote pushes Dylan in this prison with Eddie, to where for Dylan it pushes his mind and his body, throwing his body off the roof of the building in a very Nightmare on Elm Street type of way. And I forget which sequel it was, but it was the one when they was pulling Freddy out the dreams. But in this case, fortunately for Dylan, Sleeper is there, and he's able to jump off the roof and catch Dylan. But even with doing so, there's something about Dylan when he's in this connected mode, to where much like we had seen when Sleeper tried to bond with Dylan and it burned Sleeper, the same thing is happening here while Sleeper is trying to keep Dylan from falling to his death. And because of that, Sleeper is begging Dylan to break his connection so that he won't drop him. And on the other hand, you have Eddie, who's telling Dylan that he can do this and rooting for him because really he made it this far. But also with much of what Eddie has learned recently, with just surviving to this point, he lets Dylan know, like even from a bit of his own experience, that even though he's hurt, even though he's afraid, that he can still do this. And fortunately for the sake of Dylan, Sleeper was able to get him back to the rooftop, and when he did, this gave Dylan the opportunity to push a little bit harder, and with doing so, he successfully severed the connection between Eddie and the Carnage symbiote. And it's really one of those situations like sheesh, like just got these powers, and every time I turn around I gotta push a little bit harder, which really and truly translates to like how we get better at anything, because it's usually that one type of challenge that tries to nudge you like right over your comfort zone when you learn something new. But in this case, as a result, Eddie's free, he has the Venom symbiote back, but he's still stuck on the island. And in the case of the Carnage symbiote, he essentially went shark mode and he got away, which now for some odd reason has me thinking of that Man-Eater shark game. And just random question, like if any of you guys are playing that, let me know in the comments how good it is. Just curious. But either way, it's here where we get back to Eddie, and it's here where we see who he's actually talking to, when we had seen him in that moment breaking down everything from the beginning all the way through up to this point. And as it turns out, he was telling all of this to the Avengers in order to fully fill them in and prepare them for the coming of Knull. And really it's here where I have another one of these moments where I'm kind of like, well, I could imagine Thor listening to Eddie in this moment and just being like, Knull, I am familiar with him. In fact, I whooped this a couple hundred years ago. Or at least him saying something roughly to that nature. But it's here where we find out that Eddie's been telling the Avengers the connections with the Maker, to his encounter with the Grendel, to Knull being on his way, and even with a bit of other hints to things that he hasn't fully understood yet. But all in all, at this point, Eddie's come to the conclusion like this is the real deal. And at this point, with everything that's coming, like he's not really sure if they're gonna make it. Which for us, all in all, is like that teaser for the King in Black, when Knull arrives and fully unleashes terror on everyone and everything in his way. And so real quick, I want to give a special shout out to all the Patreons. Thank you guys for all of your support. And for anyone who's new here who wants more information on how to support the channel, I got a link below to where you can head to patreon.com/DopeSpill. But that'll do it for this one, guys. From here, we're going right into Venom Beyond because it just keeps getting crazier. But let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and we'll do it again in the next one. Alright, later.